We'll get started. It's just after 4 o'clock. It is my great pleasure to introduce Nathan Lau to you. Nathan works at University of Western Ontario in London, Ontario. And he is a postdoctoral researcher there with Daniel Ansari and does a lot of work on mathematics and the psychology behind mathematics. As he says on his website, his main area of interest is how early mathematical skills affect and skills and affect associated with mathematics may be related to students' math achievement. One of the things that I had just read, and one of the reasons it pushed me to want to have him come and talk to us, was a great paper that came out earlier this year in February called Disentangling the Individual and Contextual Effects of Maths Anxiety. And this got quite a lot of media interest, and it is an incredibly interesting paper and an incredibly interesting topic that I think a lot of people can really relate to. And as a mother who's got 2 teenagers going through GCSE maths, I am going to be listening very, very carefully to hear what you have to say about math anxiety. Anyway, I won't take any more of your time, Nathan, and I thank you so much for coming. And as always, people, please pop your comments or questions into the chat bar, and at the end we will take lots of questions. Great, wonderful. Thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Natasha. Just let me start this sharing. Alrighty, can everybody see the slides?
Yeah, certainly can. Yes, thank you.
Perfect. So thank you very much for the introduction. I'm really grateful that I was given the opportunity to give a talk at CEN. And as Natasha has mentioned, my name is Nathan, and I'm a postdoc working in the numerical cognition lab in the University of Western Ontario. And today I'm going to give a presentation on the individual and contextual effects of math anxiety. So to sort of start at the beginning, let me see if I can change slides. There we are. So to sort of start at the beginning, what exactly is math anxiety? Math anxiety has been described as feelings of tension, apprehension, or even dread that interferes with the ordinary manipulation of numbers. So if you have sweaty palms or butterflies in your stomach when you're asked to do math problems, you might have math anxiety. And we actually know quite a lot about math anxiety from past decades of research. Math anxiety has been observed all over the globe across age groups, and it is surprisingly prevalent in school-aged children. Some studies have estimated that a majority of students experience math anxiety to some degree, and anywhere from a quarter to a third of students seem to experience moderate to extreme levels of math anxiety. Math anxiety has been shown to be moderately related with math achievements with an R of 0.28, with placing math anxiety amongst other important predictors of math achievement, such as socio-economic status, as well as magnitude representation ability. Finally, math anxiety has been found to be independent of other types of anxiety, such as general anxiety and test anxiety. And math anxiety tends to be more predictive of math achievement than other types of anxiety. Now, in research, math anxiety occupies quite an interesting space in that it is both used as a predictor of math achievement as well as an outcome to be predicted. So let's take a look at math anxiety as a predictor of math achievement. According to the most influential accounts of how math anxiety is related with math achievement, it is hypothesized that when students are asked, with math anxiety, are asked to do math problems, intrusive thoughts such as thoughts like, I'm going to fail, or I don't know how to do this, interferes and competes for cognitive resources that's required to do the problem, which leads them to do worse in mathematics and have lower grades as a result. In contrast, when we examine math anxiety as an outcome, we get a more complicated picture. Studies have found a large variety of different variables that seem to predict math anxiety, such as parental attitudes, attentional bias, working memory capacity, and math activities at home, among others, and all these variables predict math anxiety. Now, this is all well and good in that all these variables come from the individual students or their homes. However, what we also find, and that's more interesting, is that multiple studies have found that variables in the learning environment also seem to predict math anxiety. Things like teachers' own math anxiety, teachers' expectations, as well as classroom atmosphere. Now, this is interesting because this implies that variability in math anxiety can be split between the individual level and the learning environments level. And to sort of illustrate what I mean, let's take an example of hypothetical example of 3 classes of 15 children in each. If we were to look at a predictor such as working memory capacity, we would see that each child brings to the class different levels of working memory. And the degree to which working memory affects or predicts math anxiety is different between children. However, when we look at a variable such as classroom atmosphere, we would expect that classroom atmosphere actually affects groups of children at a time. That is, different classes have different classroom atmospheres, which would predict differently on what kind of math anxiety they experience. So in this way, this implies that some of the variability in math anxiety can be attributable to class membership, to what class you're in or what school you're in. So in this way, we can sort of see that individual math anxiety, whether a child feels math anxiety or not, and classroom math anxiety, that is the average level of math anxiety in a classroom, can behave very differently. For instance, we can have a math anxious child in a low math anxious environment or a high math anxious environment, or vice versa. So the key question that we really want to ask in our study is whether or not it matters whether a child is put into a low math anxious environment versus a high math anxious environment, and whether or not placing them into a low or versus high math anxious environment affects their math achievement. And further, we would also be very interested to see whether or not one's country of origins may affect these relationships. So to put this more formally, we use a multi-level modeling method of analyzing the data, and we use a 2-level model right here. So we have the individual level model as level 1 on the top, and educational context level as level 2, and that is regression at the bottom. So the 2 regressions that you see on the screen right now are the key questions we want to ask. The top coefficient represents the question, does children's own math anxiety predict their math achievement? Controlling for average level of math anxiety in the classroom. And the bottom coefficient is the key question that we want to ask in our study, is whether or not the math anxiety of one's peers affect math achievement, controlling for children's own level of math anxiety. So for current purposes, for the rest of this talk, I will refer to the top coefficient as the individual effect and the bottom coefficient as the contextual effect. And of course, we want to ask whether or not there are between country differences in these effects. So to reiterate the research questions we want to ask whether or not math anxiety levels of one's peers affect one's achievements, and whether or not there are between country differences in the individual and contextual effects. And finally, what are the classroom country variables that predict these individual differences in contextual and individual effects. So before we go on to the methods and results, I'd just like to mention that this is a published paper, and you could look at this reference to find the paper for more details. So going on to the methods, we use the TIMSS 2015 grade 4 and grade 8 databases, as well as the PISA 2012 database. All in all, we have over 1 million students in the study. And to kind of get a scope of what we have examined, the countries in blue are the countries that were included in the TIMSS 2015, and it's quite a representative sample from North America to Europe to Middle East to Asia. So measurements of math anxiety, the TIMSS grade 4 and grade 8 use one question, and students have to indicate whether or not they agree with the statement, mathematics makes me nervous. In the PISA, it is 5 different statements ranging from worries of math class, nervousness in doing math problems, and worry of poor grades. For measurements of math achievements, both PISA and TIMSS use booklets of math problems to test students. The TIMSS tend to be more theoretically oriented, and the PISA tends to be more application oriented. And measurements of math anxiety and math achievements are typically done in the same session in the same day. So on to the first question. Is there evidence for contextual effects? So to answer this, we want to see whether or not, let's just forget about the country for now and just put all the students into a two-level model like this and ask, do we see an individual effect and a contextual effect? So what are the results? Here we find that both the individual and contextual effects are statistically significant and negative. So what does this mean? It means on the top that controlling for education environment math anxiety, higher individual math anxiety in students is related with lower math achievement. So this is something that replicates a lot of what we have in the literature. But what's more interesting is that the bottom coefficient is also true, that there is a contextual effect. And controlling for children's own math anxiety, higher peers' math anxiety is related with lower math achievements. And this is a key finding that we have in our study. And this is irrespective of your level of math anxiety that you bring to the classroom, being in a math anxious learning environment affects your math achievements. Okay, so interim conclusions that we have, ignoring country membership, we would have higher individual math anxiety is related with lower math achievements, and higher educational environment math anxiety is also related with lower math achievement. So then the next question we want to ask is, well, if we have an individual and contextual effects, are there between country differences in these effects? And this is the next question we want to ask. So what we did here is a multi-group two-level model. And essentially what we're doing is estimating the two-level model that we have in the previous slide onto each country. And here on the slides, we have data for TIMSS grade 4. And the point estimates right now are just the individual effects. And we can see that different countries have different point estimates for their individual effects. In other words, each country has different strengths of association between math anxiety and math achievements. And if you look down at the x-axis, we can see that all of these estimates are negative, meaning that higher individual math anxiety leads to lower math achievements. So we also have confidence intervals in these point estimates, and they're set up in such a way that if it crosses the 0 line that's blinking right now, that means that the effect is statistically insignificant. So as you can see, none of the CIs actually cross 0, which leads to the conclusions that virtually all countries exhibit a statistically significant negative individual effect. That is, higher individual math anxiety is associated with lower math achievements. We also see that some countries have a stronger individual effect while other countries have a weaker individual effect, which is a point that we'll come back to later down the line. So now let's look at the contextual effects. Here, we actually see quite a lot of the CIs crossing 0 in this case. And this means that some countries have a statistically significant contextual effect while other countries do not. And if we were to count how many countries, approximately 50% of countries exhibit a negative contextual effect, whereas others show no effect or very rarely a positive effect. And again, we can see that some countries have a strong contextual effect and other countries do not. So this is what the graph looks like when we put the individual and contextual effects together for each country. But what about the other two databases? Actually, when we look at the graphs for TIMSS grade 8, TIMSS grade 4, as well as the PISA, we actually get the same story going on. So point 1 is that virtually all countries see a negative association between individual math anxiety and math achievement. Except for one country in the PISA, Albania. Otherwise, all other countries show a negative effect. Point 2 is that approximately half the countries that we see, that we examine, have a negative association between classroom or peers' math anxiety and math achievement. And of course, there are between country differences in the strengths of the individual and contextual effects. So some more interim conclusions that we come to: individual math anxiety is negatively associated with math achievement in virtually all countries. Peers' math anxiety is negatively associated with math achievement, but only in some countries, and that there's a statistically significant between country differences in the strength of both the individual effect and contextual effect. So given this differences in the strength of association, the next question, natural question that we want to ask is, what predicts this variability? Okay, so going back to the results that we have right here, we can see that some countries have a stronger individual effect and other countries have weaker individual effects, and the same thing can be applied to the contextual effect. And can we actually operationalize this in a multi-level model as random slopes, which allows us to ask questions like why some countries have a stronger effect while other countries have a weaker effect. And we adopted S1 as the individual effect and S2 as the contextual effects as notations regarding that. So to answer this question, what predicts S1 and S2, we use a 3-level model, and 3-level model with level 1 being the individual level, level 2 being the educational context level, and level 3 being country level. And we included a large array of covariates as well as outcome variables. Of course, we have math achievement as outcome for all 3 levels, but we also have S1 as outcome at level 2, which asks whether or not some classrooms have a stronger or weaker individual effect, and whether or not any of these classroom variables predict this variability. We also have S1 as at level 3, which asks whether or not there are some countries with larger or smaller individual effects, and whether or not country level differences, country level variables predict this variability. And finally, we have S2 at level 3, which asks whether or not some countries have a larger or smaller contextual effects, and whether or not country level variables predict this variability. So let's go through the results one at a time. So let's look at math achievement as outcome first. First, you can see at the blinking regression coefficients right here, is that the individual and peers math anxiety remain negatively related with math achievements, even when we account for multiple important predictors, such as home SES, parental education, teacher confidence in teaching, teacher years of experience. So what this sort of tells us is that math anxiety is a very robust and important predictor of math achievement. What we also see when we look at predicting math achievement, and a very surprising result, is that higher levels of tutoring and higher levels of parental involvement with homework seems to be associated with lower math achievement. Now, of course, this is a cross-sectional design, so maybe the causal relationship could be reversed, or that a third variable is involved in some way, but this is quite an interesting result nonetheless. When we look at S1 as outcome, that is individual variability of the individual effect, we find that teachers' confidence in teaching is related with S1. In other words, what this means is that classrooms with more confident teachers tend to contain students whose math anxiety doesn't affect their math achievements as severely. So that's a very interesting finding that we have, because this shows that math anxiety requires one to be very mindful of not only the home, but the classroom, and that how they're nested within each other. Now let's look at the results at level 3. But before that, let's just go back and talk about what predictions we've actually put into the country level. And we have included the UN Human Development Index, which broadly looks at the SES of the country, as well as the 5 cultural dimensions as proposed by Hofstede. So looking at S1, you can see that no country predictors is associated with it, meaning that between country differences in the individual effect cannot really be predicted by the variables that we have. Looking at S2, however, what we can find is that the level of uncertainty avoidance of a country is associated with a smaller contextual effect. So to back up a little, what uncertainty avoidance means is a culture's propensity to avoid or dislike uncertain situations. And this propensity is related with a smaller peer effect of math anxiety. And this is quite surprising. And maybe one hypothesis that needs to be verified on why we see this as the case is that countries with higher uncertainty avoidance are also countries that tend to have more structured and rigid methods of teaching mathematics in class. And maybe math anxiety provoking situations, such as being called up to the front of the class to work out a problem in the blackboard, doesn't occur as much in these countries. But of course, this is just speculation. We would need further studies to see why this may be the case. So interim conclusions that we have, there are between country differences in the individual and contextual effects. And there's some initial evidence suggesting that both educational environments and country variables can predict this variability. So teacher confidence is related with lower individual effects, and uncertainty avoidance is related with lower contextual effects. Finally, in our final analysis, we ask what predicts math anxiety. We have this wealth of different variables that can predict math achievement, but what about math anxiety? And this is what we did. Again, a 3-level model with individual educational context and country levels. Let's just approach each level at a time. So at the individual level, the strongest predictor of student math anxiety is the student's attitudes towards the math teacher. And the higher the student's attitudes towards math teacher, the lower the math anxiety. And this is a very strong effect. What we also see, again, very surprisingly, is that higher degrees of tutoring as well as parental involvement with homework is associated with higher math anxiety. And what this sort of tells us when we look at this as well as look at its relationship with homework is maybe the association is reversed, where maybe children with higher math anxiety or children with lower math achievements tend to be already need help, and that's why we see a higher degree of parental involvement as well as tutoring. When we look at level 2, much less variables are predictive of math anxiety, and indeed, only 2 of these variables are predictive of math anxiety. First, we have higher degrees of teacher confidence is associated with lower math anxiety, and given other predictors such as teachers' years of experience as well as teacher major, it seems like math anxiety at the classroom is sort of propelled by teachers' affect rather than teacher competence. We also have higher math homework frequency being associated with higher math anxiety, which sort of coincides with what we have in the previous slide. And finally, we have no country level predictors predicting math anxiety at the 3rd level, which is very interesting. So some interim conclusions. Students' attitudes towards math teachers seems to be a very strong predictor of math anxiety, and parental involvement as well as homework frequency seems to also predict math anxiety. So what are some overall conclusions that we can draw looking at all this data together? So math anxiety and its effects is manifest in multiple nested layers of analysis. So we have country, we have classroom, as well as the individual. And we can't really just ignore one and look at the rest of it because it will give us an incomplete picture. We also have levels of math anxiety, and the severity of its effects seems to be associated with parents, teachers, and the activities that are done with the students. So this is something that future studies could keep in mind to see what this may, how these variables come together to relate math anxiety with math achievement. So this is the study that we have presented. What are the next steps? So as I've mentioned, this study is a cross-sectional design. So we can't really say anything about the causality of the different variables. And especially with this new contextual effects of math anxiety, where one's peers may be related with math achievements, the question of causality is very important. Is it because my peers are math anxious that leads me to have lower math anxiety, math achievements? Or is it because the class has lower math achievements that leads to higher class math anxiety? Either way, it is a very interesting question because this effect is only there for half the countries that are examined, but not the other half, which may lead to future studies examining why some countries have this contextual effects and others do not, and whether or not some countries can learn from different countries on how to tackle this contextual effect. And then a next question we can ask is, what is the underlying mechanisms of this contextual effect? So as in the individual effect, it is hypothesized that when I feel math anxious and I see math problems, I get intrusive thoughts. Why is it my peers' math anxiety seems to affect my math achievement? Is it because seeing my peers being math anxious leads me to be more anxious myself, which leads me to have lower math achievements. This is something that we might want to examine with future studies. And finally, why do some countries see a significant contextual effect while others do not? Are there cultural factors involved? Are there organizational factors involved? Those things are definitely topics that we could examine in the future. So thank you very much for listening to this talk. And I'd like to thank Dr. Daniel Ansari, as well as Dr. Paul Trombley, and everyone in the Numerical Cognition Lab for all your help and suggestions. So thank you very much. And if there are any questions, I'd be happy to address them.
Thank you so much, Nathan. That was fantastic. If you want to stop sharing your screen, we can maybe open it up to some questions. And hopefully there will be some coming through in the chat, or feel free to put your hand up. I found that incredibly interesting. I was a little bit overwhelmed by the graphs. I could have stared at those all day because it is incredibly interesting to see which countries are up and which ones are down. And I was kind of freaked out when I saw that the United Arab Emirates seemed to be the complete opposite with contextual versus individual. And so of course your mind rushes everywhere. And of course you can't do that. You have to sort of, as you very well said at the end of your talk, you have to go through all of these different reasons. I see that Rebecca has her hand up, but if I can be rude because I'm hosting and take the first question, and then I'll let Rebecca have a question. My main question was one that basically just why you think this didn't show up, because almost all of the stuff I've read about or looked at tends to come up with something to do with gender. And it is, maybe that's an urban legend now. Maybe that's no longer a thing that you see higher maths anxiety in girls versus boys. But were you expecting that? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, it is quite interesting in our results that we did find that there are gender differences in regards to, it seems like girls tend to have higher math anxiety than boys. However, it really depends on, we got to keep in mind that the TIMS only use one Russian in this case. So then the accuracy of math anxiety in this case might not be as good as like the PISA, which uses 5 questions. And the literature is rather split with regards to whether or not we do see a gender effect or not. So it is unfortunately an open question whether or not there are gender differences.
Thank you. And I'll let Rebecca take over now.
Thanks, Natasha. Thanks, Nathan. I agree. That was just so interesting. And I, again, could look at those figures for a long time. The cultural aspects, of course, are very, very interesting. And you say that that's something that you need to look at in the future. Do you have any idea of what that might look like, the sort of things that you're going to look at, how you might examine that further?
Well, it really depends on, I suppose, the scope of the study. For example, if there's an international collaboration between a country with higher uncertainty avoidance versus lower uncertainty avoidance, then you can then it is possible to say have one lab collect data from their students on one country versus another and then compare the two. So that's definitely a possible way. So for example, from memory, I believe that Eastern Asian countries tend to have a higher degree of uncertainty avoidance. So maybe what we could do is to invite some colleagues from, say, Hong Kong, Singapore, or Japan to collect data on their students, and then we compare it to some Western samples. So that's one way. And of course, the more countries, the merrier, and then we could do more complicated analysis in that way as well.
Thank you. I wondered whether you were going to do some kind of broader analysis of cultural differences, maybe using secondary data, or doing some kind of meta-analysis or something like that, outside of actually testing maths anxiety. Which, I mean, obviously it would be difficult to sort of stitch that together, but it would give. Yeah.
That is actually very interesting, because we did have a recent meta-analysis that looked at between country differences in math anxiety. It is probably possible to use that data set to see whether or not uncertainty avoidance actually pop up in between country differences in those countries as well. So that's a very great suggestion.
Great. I look forward to it then.
Are there any other questions that anyone would like to jump on? I can probably just keep asking tons of stuff because I find this very interesting, but please put your hand up or pop stuff in the chat bar if you're interested in asking something. I wanted to kind of follow up on the teacher confidence thing, if that was okay. I'm quite intrigued by that from a very lay perspective, thinking about that. And I'm wondering if you were planning on following up, looking at something along the lines of sort of the differences in teacher education. I've lived in a few different countries in my life, and I have noted that there are huge differences between countries on how you are educated to become a teacher. Some countries, like Canada, for example, it's a postgraduate degree, and there are other countries where it's an undergraduate degree or not. There's lots of differences, and I was just wondering if, I don't know, if there was something to be said for that, and if you're looking at cultural differences and you're looking at countries, are you going to take into account sort of how the teachers get to where they are?
Mm-hmm. That is definitely a concern that we have. Whether or not teacher confidence reflects teacher competence, or does it reflect just how confident they are in teaching? So that is, it is actually quite a difficult sort of issue to sort of address, because we can expect that maybe adding a country level in our model would sort of tease out a lot of between country differences in math achievement. So what's left in our level 2 is actually more or less, irrespective of what country you're from, how does teachers affect students' math achievement and math anxiety. But it is definitely a point that, like, whether or not teachers' confidence in teaching, what does it represent? And another thing I'd like to mention is that teacher confidence in teaching is actually related with teacher math anxiety as well. So then, since we don't have a measurement of teacher math anxiety, we don't really know whether or not the effects that we've shown right here is because of teacher math anxiety, teacher confidence, or teacher ability, or something like that. So it's definitely an open question, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's a very good point. I mean, as you were sort of saying, it doesn't necessarily reflect competence. I was thinking, no, you're absolutely right. I've seen, even in myself, I can be very confident about things where I have very low competence. So I think that's probably a very important point to bring up. Sorry, Maria, you have a question. Please go ahead.
Hello, thank you so much for the presentation. It's been really, really interesting, especially because I'm doing a dissertation on math anxiety kind of for my master's, and I'm currently thinking of the ways to proceed onto a PhD because there's so many questions. And actually the question about countries was one of also one of the ideas that I had. I'm interested in parental engagement, and it's not really a question, but like maybe just a prompt for discussion that I have. Now the world is so global and people move around a lot, and I found from experience that even when, say, some families are within the country with different measures as per Hofstede, for example, within the household, they still hold the ones from the country they're originally from. And so I have experience with Russian families, and I noticed very often that there is a discrepancy between how the family might see math and how it's presented at school. And this discrepancy, I thought, might lead also to math anxiety, because whereas the school might be having really good teachers and teachers who are maybe confident, and they're creating a lower anxiety environment, when the children come to home, there is a different story there.
Right, that's definitely a great point. the interaction between teachers and the home, right? And as we have like kind of shown in this sort of paper, that there definitely it seems like there is quite a bit of interaction between parents and teachers and how these things occur. Because as we can see, parental involvement with homework is associated with higher math anxiety and lower math achievement, right? It may be that cultural differences in how mathematics learning is approached between the teacher's culture as well as the parents' culture may exacerbate this relationship. So it's definitely a very interesting thing to look at. I would think like a multi-level modeling perspective would definitely help with tackling this problem. Yeah, but I'm not too sure how exactly. I think I would need more thought in thinking of a study design in this case then. But it's definitely a very interesting and pressing issue that should be addressed.
In the chat, Gaia has said, is there any data regarding the relationship between teacher confidence and years of experience in teaching, both in general and specifically teaching math courses? I'm not sure that you have the data.
That is something that I would need to go back to look at the data to see if there is a correlation. Because they're used as predictors though, in our model right now. Basically, we're controlling for it. So controlling for teacher confidence or years of experience, these relationships still come up. But unfortunately, I don't have this data on hand.
Are there any other questions?
Can I just jump in with another one? Sorry to be cheeky. I find it just so interesting because I know I did my PhD looking at predictors of mathematical ability, and whenever I mentioned it to people, they would go, "Oh, I'm terrible at maths," or "You should use me as a subject because I'm just so rubbish at maths." And it was so volunteered so quickly, much quicker than anybody would say, "Oh, I'm rubbish at reading." You know, and there is this kind of general in the UK. I'm talking purely about the UK and Australia because it's kind of in both countries of this. Well, just like this generalized mathematical anxiety disorder, if you like. And a friend of mine who was a teacher, he had like 20 years of teaching, very, very confident individual, a very good teacher, a teacher that was very, very much liked. And he wanted to swap from being a physical education teacher to being a maths teacher. And so he was in a group of people who had all done other types of teaching and then were going to do it was a secondary school, so they had to get up to a very specific level. And I remember this so clearly. He said in the first class they had on this, the teacher, the lecturer said, "Okay, right, everybody, we're going to do a maths test." And he said, "I want everybody to get a pencil. You'll just need a pen and paper out, blah, blah, blah." And he gave them a few minutes to do this. And then he said, "Right, who's sweating? Who's shaking? Who's scared?" And he said the whole room were like, "Oh, yeah," because there's this general fear of mathematics. And of course, the objective for the lecturer was to remove that, but also make them aware of that this is a feeling that many students will have as well. So I'm just sort of like, obviously this will be something you're aware of, but I just find it so interesting that at least in the UK and Australia, there is this really prevalent fear of maths, whether you would call it an anxiety disorder or not. But anyway, I don't know whether you have any comment on that, but it just felt relevant to say.
That is actually very interesting in that the fear, like different cultures have really different ways of approaching mathematics, and like whether or not like at least like for example when I was a teacher in Hong Kong, actually students they do fear math as well, but they don't ever vocalize it. So it's very interesting in that sense. But what one surprising finding that we have in our study is that we don't see a contextual effect of country, nor none of our predictors of math anxiety at the country level was statistically significant. But actually, this is something that we have not included in the main study and is actually in the appendix, is that this is different in the PISA though. And we see that in the PISA, there's actually a contextual effect of country. That is one's overall environment where you live in. They have different levels of math anxiety, and that also affects your math achievements. We didn't include it in the study because it wasn't replicated in all three databases, but it's definitely something that we could look at. And the reason, and another question that we can ask is, why is there this difference between the TIMSS and the PISA? Yeah, like it's definitely very difficult to study country level differences because it just takes so many data points to actually get it. And even with TIMSS and PISA, we get a little bit of a contradictory result. So it is a big problem that we would need to tackle in the future, I think.
Thank you. I see there's some more in the chat, so I'll let Natasha.
Thank you. Maria, is your hand still up? Is that a legacy hand or do you have another question? Okay, all right, fine. Let me go. Yes, we have a question from Chris. I might have missed this, but did you look at academic achievement in other subjects at the country level as a way for controlling for general academic achievement at the country level?
I have not. So we've elected to just focus on math achievements, but it is definitely better if we have included math or just achievement in general as well.
Yeah, that would be quite interesting though, to see if there's some sort of generalized trend as well. Colleen has mentioned that one of her grad students, Andrea Burrell, is looking at the relationship between teacher confidence and years of teaching experience, but looking at teacher math anxiety instead of confidence. So maybe we could get her to come and give a talk when she gets the answer. That would be fantastic. Diana would like to know if you could say a little bit more about student attitudes towards the teacher, which I think would be, that would be interesting to pull that apart a bit.
Yeah, so in that variable, there are several questions. A lot of the questions pertains to whether or not my teacher explains well in class. Are they fair to me? Do they give me feedback and things like that? So the more the student agrees to these questions, then the lower their math anxiety, students' math anxiety.
Excellent. We have a hand up from Roberto, if you'd like to.
Hi, thank you. Thank you very much for your talk. I have a question. When I saw the map that you showed, the only country from South America, I think, was Chile. Was that a particular reason why you took Chile? And the second question is whether you've seen different patterns depending on the region, let's say, for example, countries from South America, or Europe, or Asia regarding anxiety.
I am not too sure why the TIMSS only included one country from South America. It might be whether or not the country agrees to collect data at that time in 2015 or not. Different years have slightly different country memberships, unfortunately. But it is definitely something we would definitely need more countries in South America to see whether or not there are differences in that specific continent. With regards to regional differences, actually, we have not. We just look at country membership. But with regards to HDI as well as the 5 cultural dimensions, similar regions tend to have similar scores. So even though we haven't actually looked at regions specifically, we do kind of show it is more or less a cultural thing rather than a country-specific thing.
Lots of chat still going on. Some of them just sort of talking back and forth to each other. I think it's really interesting how many people are talking about as teachers and educators that maths anxiety is just something that is just talked about all the time. And I particularly like when someone said that it's a source of pride for many. And I know exactly what you mean. It's this kind of, I mean, I see that in my children and I've heard that a lot, that it's just, oh, I'm no good at maths. It's very categorical where people seem to think that you can get better in English or whatever languages, but oh, maths, you just can't. Where am I now? Masha said, could you tell if students' anxiety was affected by the results outcome? I'm assuming meaning where their anxiety sort of related to how well they actually did. Did it predict anything? Sorry, Masha, if I'm wrong by that, just let me know.
So is it that does achievement predict math anxiety? I'm assuming that's.
I think the idea is are they, again, Masha, let me know if I'm saying this the wrong way, but is it realistic in a sense? I mean, is their anxiety affected by what their outcomes are in these tests? So does that add to their anxiety the next time, or you know, are they right to be anxious because actually their outcomes are poor or something along those lines?
That's definitely a very interesting question, and it is something that we're, like in the literature, we're actually addressing as well. In our study right now, we've just say math anxiety predicts math achievements, but there is like an undercurrent of studies that kind of show that it is the reversed, or maybe it is some sort of, it depends on the time frame. So for example, maybe math anxiety predicts math achievements in a very short time frame when I am inducing math anxiety when showing you math problems. But in the longer term, like over years or months, what's happening is like having consecutive lower math achievements leads you to have higher math anxiety. So it could be that it really depends on the time frame that you're looking at. And it could be that, you know, the relationship can be reversed, or that it is cyclical in some way.
Yes, Masha, if the anxiety about math as a subject or the fear of failure. I see, as fear of failure a predictor of math anxiety. Okay, yeah. Yeah. Okay. I mean, just the number of questions that are going on shows you just how much we need to know about this particular subject. I mean, it really caught my interest. And the paper, I do recommend everyone to read the paper. It's incredibly good, and it asks a lot of really interesting questions. Obviously, you've heard the punchline now, but it is it's still a very interesting paper to read. Sorry, I'm blithering. Are there any other questions or comments or thoughts?
Natasha, forgive me if I missed this while I was just replying to Donna Lynn. But Diana asked a question about what do you mean by student attitudes towards the teacher? Did you cover that? Was I typing? You did. I'm sorry. My apologies, because I was interested in the answer. I'll watch the recording.
Yeah, sorry, no worries. Maria has said, I might have missed this, but I was wondering if you were thinking about possible interventions to reduce maths anxiety.
That's very interesting. It is very difficult for us to sort of say anything in this specific paper regarding intervention, unfortunately, because the causal direction between these variables cannot really be stated using a cross-sectional design. For example, if we were to say that it is peers' math anxiety affecting my math performance, for example, then we can look at some countries with, we can look at between country differences in how classes are sort of carried out by teachers, and see whether or not some ways of carrying out classes leads to lower math anxiety, which then leads to lower math achievements. Unfortunately, this requires a lot more research to see whether or not these interventions will make sense. So I think the next step would be to establish the causal relationship between these variables first. Once we've gotten that, then we can see whether or not any sort of interventions or changes to classrooms would affect classroom math anxiety in this case.
I'm just also interested in your data on that. The more parents, I've read this also, I think in other papers as well, that basically there's data that the parents who help more, for example, the children have actually higher math anxiety. And so when you, okay, for example, if you look at data saying that peers are the reason why I have math anxiety, then we can work with the school, you know, but you cannot tell parents, don't do homework with your child, you're making it worse, you know. So I'm kind of like thinking, what could because you have those results as well, right? So you have results which can be more classroom oriented, which are, I guess, a bit easier to actually work with, as opposed to parents, because how do you communicate this to them? What kind of, through school, or if, I don't know if you were kind of thinking about that at all.
This is very chicken and egg problem going on here, unfortunately. We don't know, is it because students have higher math anxiety because the parents are helping, or lower math achievement because the parents are helping. It could be the case that it is children who already has higher math anxiety and lower math achievements. They need more help, and parents see that and then they go help them. So it is definitely like a question that we need to address first, whether or not it is one causing the other or the other way around first. Once we've gotten that, then we can sort of figure out why does, for example, if parents involve themselves with homework, it actually decreases their achievements or increases their math anxiety. This definitely, it's definitely a very important question for us to address. And this result right here is actually like, with regards to homework and such, it's actually not the first paper that has found this result. It's actually, there was actually a recent meta-study that showed this as well. And unfortunately, causal relationships are very hard to establish in studies. But once we've gotten that, then we can definitely look at them.
Thank you. Somebody has asked about the access to the research article. I'm not sure which one you meant, Maria, Masha, if you meant, I think you mean Nathan's research article.
Yep, I've typed the reference.
I think they're trying to figure out if they can get it.
Oh yeah. It's already open, so you can just go find it on Google, and it should be there.
Yeah. Okay. Sounds good. Okay. All right. Thank you. And to be fair, if you can't find it, do email me, because I can usually find these things fairly easily through one source or another. So just making sure I haven't missed anything. Interventions, some very good articles have been put up, which is wonderful. All right, well, if there are no other questions, I would.
Ira has her hand up, sorry.
Oh, I'm so sorry, Irwaz, coming in right at the end.
Earlier you stole my question about, which was about teacher training and how that might be affecting their anxiety. So yeah, thank you very much for the talk. I was just downloaded the paper, and I was wondering about, when you're talking about the parents, Maria was talking about intervention for the parents. I was wondering whether you had anything on the parent anxiety, and it looks like you do have the parental attitude to math and science, and that it is a predictor. And I think it's quite interesting to see that it's separate to the math homework involvement, because I was wondering whether that may be an interplay here, that the parents are anxious and trying to help their kids, but they're really anxious about it. They could communicate anxiety to their children. And so an intervention could be to tell parents not to talk about being bad at maths, because that's something that might negatively influence their children. That's
definitely definitely is valid, I think. Unfortunately, we don't have specific measurements of parents' math anxiety. The attitudes that we have on the paper is actually questions like whether or not I think math or science is important for their future, or so on and so forth. It's not so much like whether or not I like math myself. So it's definitely a thing that maybe it is true that parents pass on their math anxiety through helping their kids. And there are studies in the literature that seem to show that. Unfortunately, more studies is required. This study doesn't really address it adequately, unfortunately, but it's definitely very interesting and very important.
I think what we are saying here is we'd like you to do all the studies, and if you just get back to us when you've sorted all of how all the variables relate, then we'd be happy to listen to you tell us. Once again, thank you so much, Nathan. This has been a really, really interesting talk, and a lot of great questions, and I think a lot of us are going to be thinking more deeply about this in the future, and we hope that you keep us updated with your next findings. As always, thank you to everyone who's attended. It's been wonderful. We have actually remembered to record it, so you can go and find it if you missed part or you want to see the slides, etc. So thank you so much, and we'll look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you.